What's up, everybody? It's Kevin here from Happy Beard Games, and this is my series, Nintendo NES, from A to Zelda. And today's episode is a big one. A big game. Final Fantasy for the Nintendo NES. Yeah, let's check out this Final Fantasy game on the Nintendo NES as we look at what this game is all about, what makes it great, and the legacy that it leaves behind.
The Nintendo Entertainment System.
Your parents help you look it up.
The Nintendo Entertainment System.
Now you're playing with power.
Now, the game Final Fantasy is a JRPG, a Japanese role-playing game that takes place in turn-based battles throughout a fantasy world setting. It's similar in ways to the Western game Dungeons & Dragons, the tabletop game. Final Fantasy was created by a man named Hironobu Sakaguchi, who also worked with musical composer Nobuo Uematsu on the game Final Fantasy, but previously and earlier that same year, they both worked on another game for the NES called Rad Racer. Yeah, Rad Racer. We played that one earlier on Happy Beard Games. The game Final Fantasy was a game that at its time of release in 1990 in the North American regions was a bit too complicated or thought of to be too complex or complicated for the normal, intended for, Nintendo NES audience. It's a deep RPG, similar in vein to Dragon Quest, which I've covered in a past video on this series, and it's similar to Dragon Quest in ways that it has an RPG style, it has a fantasy setting, and it has a quest-like story. But as the game Dragon Quest Dragon Warrior in North America was its main competition, Dragon Quest featured a single-player game with one party member, so it's only one party member you have to manage and keep track of their leveling up, their stats, their abilities and spells. On Final Fantasy, you have 4. In the game Final Fantasy, you begin by selecting your party members, your team of adventurers that you go on your quest throughout the entire game of Final Fantasy. Unlike its sequels, you don't meet characters throughout the story and have them join you in your adventure. You start out with them already in your party at the beginning of the game. You can choose from only 4 characters to have in your party, but you can choose from 6 different job class types to choose for each of the characters. You can even have some of them be the same job. Out of those 6 job types, there are the fighter, the black belt, the thief, then there's the magic users, the red mage, the white mage, and the black mage. Each of them have their own specific qualities and strengths and weaknesses, as well as certain abilities such as using magic or using different weapon types. So in Final Fantasy, you start out with 4 characters, you choose your job class for each. I chose a very simple, beginner's, easy setup as detailed in the Explorer's Handbook. I chose the fighter, the black belt, the white mage, and the black mage for this run. In previous runs, I've used the red mage, and I've thought that was pretty cool too. I also really like the thief as well, so I don't want to discount him. But in this game, I named my characters after some of my YouTube friends. So I have me, Kevin, as the fighter. For the black belt, I've got my friend Chris from DC Radaya. He likes martial arts and tokusatsu, so I added that as the black belt. I also added my friend Ryan from RPG Tour Guide, who's added me as a name in his own Final Fantasy games. so I figured I'd return the favor, and he loves RPGs, so I made him the white mage, and I made my buddy Brian the black mage. You might have seen him on some of my past Hybrid Games videos, and I've done collaborations with him as well. So that's the party of Final Fantasy. A majority of the game of Final Fantasy takes place within turn-based battles. These battles are encountered at random on the main field, or when you're entering a boss battle. This Final Fantasy battle system was the first of its kind to feature enemies on the left, players on the right, and a full battle scene played out throughout the battle. If you've played a Final Fantasy game before, you know all about these turn-based battles. Final Fantasies 1 through 10 featured turn-based battles of various different styles, but all pretty much had the same style of taking turns, fighting enemies. In the first game, there's no ATB, no active time battle system. You don't know when your turn is coming up exactly. All your players take their turn choices at the same time, and then it's played out in a back and forth action between you and the enemies. Sometimes it seems pretty random who gets to go first in the actual attacks. And did I mention this game is slow? It's very slow on the battle system. If you think Final Fantasy IX was slow, this is about 3 times slower than that. These battles take a long time. They give you a lot more time for strategy and thinking, however, and the slow-paced battles kind of add to the experience because there's not as much to do when you're just walking around the world map. So it is fun to do the battles, but also, additionally to the battles being slow, you don't get that much experience points and you don't level up very fast either. When you're looking at the Final Fantasy battle screen, it looks pretty different than future Final Fantasies. You don't have a full-color background, you don't have a field, you just have an image of the background on the very back top of the screen. The screen is also divided into different squares. The first square is enemies. There could be up to 9 different enemies on this square at once. You can fight up to 9 different enemies in a single battle. The square to the right is your characters, so your characters always stay inside this box, and they fight and perform their actions throughout this box. And to the very right of your characters, you have the characters' names as well as their current hit points, their current health in the game. Once that runs out to 0, your character is knocked out and must be revived at a town clinic. There is no Phoenix Downs. Looking at the bottom of the screen, you've got 2 more boxes as well. These represent the monster names and how many monsters are left on the screen, so you can select them during your turn. And the one on the right indicates your actions. This is the most important part of the battle screen because this is the only thing you can actually select with your controller, and this is where the battle is truly played out. So in this action box, you've got the basic commands. You've got Fight, which allows you to attack your enemy with your weapon in hand. It's a basic attack, not magic, and not a special ability, just your basic attack. The second option is Magic, and this only really works for mages. So you've got the Red Mage, White Mage, and Black Mage once again. We've got a White Mage and Black Mage on our team, but no Red Mage. Now the White Mage can use healing spell magic, as well as things to cure status ailments such as poison. The Black Mage, however, uses his magic for attack, and you can use things like Fire and Ice, and once you get to level 3 magic spells, you can do things like Fire 2, which will attack all enemies on the field at 1 turn. Whoa. The next option is Drink. Drink? What is Drink? Drink is basically you use a potion. You can use a potion to heal yourself, or you can choose to give that potion to anyone on your team. Now this next one might be referred to differently in remakes or sequels of Final Fantasy, but it's called Item. Item is basically lets you choose your equipment and your accessories. The last action is Run. You can click on it and try to run and escape from that battle scenario. Now on your turn, when you go to attack an enemy, use the Fight command or use a black magic spell maybe. It'll show the monster's name and how much damage they take. Sometimes you can get things like critical hits, and sometimes you can be blocked by different types of defenses that the enemy might have, so you might end up doing 0 damage if you miss your attack or spell. Once you've defeated every enemy on the screen, you complete the battle and you hear that victory fanfare, a staple of the Final Fantasy series. Final Fantasy, or Final Fantasy I as it's known as it's part of a series, Final Fantasy is light on the story and plot, compared to future games that is, because the future games feature plot-heavy scenarios, characters, and storylines, so you have to really focus on and go pretty deep within the stories of their own games. Each Final Fantasy is a separate universe, for the most part, and has its own separate storylines. So Final Fantasy II is not a direct sequel to the characters and story and world of Final Fantasy I necessarily. They feature similar themes and styles in the gameplay, but it's more of an anthology. So what is the basic story and plot of Final Fantasy I? Basically, you are 4 warriors of light, the characters that you chose at the start of the game. You walk into a kingdom, you meet the king. The king tells you that his daughter, the Princess Sarah, has been kidnapped by the evil Garland, so you go on your quest to destroy Garland. You actually defeat Garland within the first hour or so of the game, depending on how slow or how long you take for the battles. I'd recommend getting to level 2, by the way. And then when you go to fight Garland, you defeat him. Is that the end of the game? Princess Sarah is rescued, and you bring her back home to the kingdom, so everything's safe there. The king builds a bridge, and when you cross that bridge, you see the credits. But it's not the credits for the end of the game. Nope, this is a long one. This is the opening credits for Final Fantasy. So the basic plot of Final Fantasy is that each of your characters is a warrior of light. They each carry an orb. In this orb, it is empty, so you must defeat one of the 4 elemental fiends to get the power and put it into that orb, also known as a crystal in some versions of the game. This orb will then become light, and you can use the 4 orbs to restore peace and save the world. It's a pretty big story. You're saving the world. You're 4 awesome heroes on a giant adventure in Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy's main competitor was Dragon Warrior, or Dragon Quest as it's known in Japan. Dragon Quest was a RPG that we talked about a few episodes ago, so I don't need to talk about it too much here. So in the game Dragon Quest, there's a part where you rescue a princess from an evil dragon, and it seems like that's the end of your quest and the end of the game. Similarly how in Legend of Zelda you rescue Princess Zelda at the end of the game. Well, in Dragon Quest, it doesn't follow that same story, and the game continues on much longer after you rescue the princess. That story is very similar to the start of Final Fantasy, how you rescue Princess Sarah at the beginning, and you think it might be the end, but it's a much longer game than that. And I like that about these 2 games, Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. But what's up with the title of the game, Final Fantasy? Is it the last game in the series? What's up with this series name, Final Fantasy? Originally, Final Fantasy game creator Hironobu Sakaguchi wanted to create a game series with the title FF as the abbreviation, so it was going to be called Fighting Fantasy. Fighting Fantasy was also the name of a tabletop game around the same time in the late 80s, so they couldn't name it that due to copyright reasons. One of those reasons is that the game Final Fantasy, if unsuccessful, would have been Hironobu Sakaguchi's final game that he ever made, because he would have returned to college and done something else with his life. So, thankfully, Final Fantasy was a great game, a great success, and spawned a huge series and franchise that continues to this day. The other reason they called it Final Fantasy was because it was the final game that Company Square had the budget to create. The company Square was going to go out of business until the game Final Fantasy saved it. And while these 2 seem like perfect reasons to name the series Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi has said later on that he could have gone with any word that started with the letter F. So instead of Fighting Fantasy or Final Fantasy, we might have got something else, but I think Final Fantasy is the most appropriate and sounds the best. So where can you play Final Fantasy today? Well, actually, it's kind of hard to find today because it's not on the eShop. It's not on Nintendo Switch, it's not on the PS4 as far as I know, the Xbox One and stuff like that, and then the next wave of consoles it may or may not get remade for. Final Fantasy is a little bit hard to find. The most recent re-release was on the Nintendo NES Classic Edition, and we all know how hard it is to get one of those now. The most recent remake of Final Fantasy 1 was on the 3DS, but only in Japan on the eShop. It was a 3D remaster of the PSP version of Final Fantasy. Now, Final Fantasy has been remade many times once again. Usually it's bundled with the game Final Fantasy II, even though they're not directly connected. When Final Fantasy's developers, Square, decided to bring Final Fantasy to the North American regions, they thought it might be a little too complex for Western gamers. So they included a 80-page Explorer's Handbook with each copy of the game Final Fantasy. This Explorer's Handbook is a how-to-play, and it's more than just your normal instruction manual. It gives you tips and tricks, some maps, full-color photos, and guides on how to play the game the best. And it's more like a strategy guide and a how-to-play, step-by-step, through your way of the game Final Fantasy. But it wasn't enough to just include an 80-page guidebook to Final Fantasy. They also included this full-color poster of the Final Fantasy world map of the game, which actually helps you out throughout the game because you're traveling amongst a world map. And on the back of that world map, you have a guide to every monster enemy in the entire game. with their stats and information for each. But they also included one more two-sided poster, and that includes the dungeon maps, the insides of the palaces, temples, and caves that you'll go through in the game Final Fantasy, and how everything's laid out exactly. And on the back side of that, you have information about all of the magic spells, the weapons, and the armor in the game of Final Fantasy. Pretty detailed stuff. Here's another Final Fantasy trivia. Did you know that Final Fantasy was featured in the TV series Captain N the Game Master? Captain N the Game Master is a video game-themed American-Canadian animated television series that aired from 1989 to 1991 and featured many classic Nintendo-era video game characters and heroes. In this episode, which is titled The Fractured Fantasy of Captain N, Kevin, Princess Lana, Kid Icarus, and Mega Man go to the world of Final Fantasy. In this world, they go to meet a prince in a kingdom, but along the way, Kevin gets stopped by Astos, who's in disguise. Astos was the name and character of the Dark Elf from Final Fantasy. Some other slight Final Fantasy references appear throughout the episode, including a magical key, as well as, is that Matoya, the witch? Whoa, that's a weird interpretation. Alright everyone, that's it for today's episode of Nintendo NES from A to Zelda. We had letter F today for Final Fantasy, and this was a really interesting RPG. It was a lot of fun to play. It's a little outdated today. I'll warn you about that. It's outdated, but it's still fun to play if you're into that NES style. A more slower, laid-back, slow-paced Final Fantasy or RPG style game. And it's a fun one still. It's fun. It's been remade, so you might want to check out the remakes instead. But on the NES, it's still a fun game, and a notable game in the Nintendo NES library. Alright everyone, thanks for watching Hybrid Games. Stay tuned for more classic gaming goodness. You can check out more Nintendo NES from A to Zelda coming up soon with letter G. What will the game be? I have no idea. And remember, you can check me out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter as well. Alright everyone, bye!